Bitter Creek, winter of 1874. A blizzard swept across the valley as though it meant to erase every trace of man. Inside a weathered cabin, widow Eleanor Whitmore clutched her two children close, counting each howl of wind through the cracks and praying the night would pass swiftly. Then it came, the thunder of hooves in the snow. At her door lay a stranger, half dead, his chest soaked in blood, a black coat glazed with ice. His prized horse collapsed beside him. A wounded man in the storm, dragged inside by the mercy of a widow's hand. Within the cabin, the fire flickered weak and uncertain, lighting wary eyes that measured every breath he took. Outside, the storm screamed and wolves howled in the distance. Eleanor did not yet know. The choice to keep that stranger through the night would be the very door that opened onto days her family could never turn back from. The winter of 1874 descended upon Bitter Creek, Colorado, with winds that seemed never to tire, dragging ice that clung thick upon every weather-worn roof. The small town, pressed into the hollow of the valley, was already a harsh place most years, but that winter bore down heavier than any before. Snow fell in wide, blinding sheets, so dense that even the sound of wagon horses passing along Main Street was swallowed quickly, buried beneath the endless white. In a sagging wooden cabin at the edge of Bitter Creek, Eleanor Whitmore sat close to the fire, clutching a frayed woolen shawl tight around her shoulders. The flames in the stove sputtered low, fed by scraps of wood her son Caleb had gathered that morning. Caleb, 11 years old, was thin and too tall for his age, but his eyes carried the same sharp, stubborn light that once burned in his father's. Beside him sat Mary, 9, small and slight, her patched sweater doing little to keep the chill away. She cupped her hands before the weak fire, as if to swallow what little warmth it gave. Eleanor's heart twisted at the sight of them. This winter stretched longer than any she had known, and the death of William, her husband, still left a hollow no hand could fill. 4 months had passed since the sickness of the lungs carried him off, and all the weight had fallen upon her shoulders. The house sagged, the barn leaned, and the land gave nothing but a handful of leftover potatoes. On the kitchen shelf, only an empty cornmeal sack and a jar of brine remained. Worry clung to her like a second skin, robbing her of every night's rest. Outside, the wind roared, battering the door, shrieking through the cracks until the walls themselves trembled. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter, trying to ignore the sound, as if a wild beast clawed for a way in. But then, through the storm's voice, another sound reached her. No wind, no falling tree. The sound of a horse. Faint at first, like metal striking far away. Then clearer, unsteady, a staggering rhythm. Caleb's head snapped up. "Mother, you hear it?" Mary clutched his hand, her voice thin. What horse would be out there now? Eleanor rose, her heart hammering. She pressed her ear against the door, listening. Yes, the sound of hooves, but not steady as a rider's mount. Heavy, dragging, as though the beast itself fought against the storm. For an instant, an old memory pierced her. William returning late from a hunt, the sound of hooves on frozen ground meaning he was safe again. She shook her head hard, banishing the thought. William lay beneath a grave of snow, and this sound belonged to another. Wanderer, or worse. Outlaw. The thought flared sharp. Her hand tightened on the door's latch. Then the noise broke. A long, strangled cry. The desperate bellow of a horse before it fell. Eleanor did not think further. She wrenched the door open. A blast of cold struck her lungs. Snow stung her face like needles. pulling her scarf. Close, she stepped out. Caleb started forward, but she held him back. Watch your sister. The world was white beneath a veiled moon. She followed the deep impressions across the drifted yard. There, half buried in snow, lay a sight that seized her chest. A black horse, tall and sleek, fallen in a pool of red. Beside it, a man sprawled face down, his heavy cloak rimed with frost, his back soaked through with blood. Eleanor dropped to her knees, heaving the weight until his face turned upward. A man in his middle years, features stern yet drained of color, beard and hair stiffened with ice. His breath came in shallow threads, each one close to breaking. Leaning nearer, she saw the wound, blood blooming from his chest, soaking deep into his coat. The horse beside him was gone for good. Its silver-trimmed saddle bore ornate engravings, the letter H etched into the leather seat, worth more than her broken-down farmstead. Yet her eyes fixed on the man. Who was he? And why had fate dropped him at her door in the heart of the storm? A war raged inside her. To drag him home meant feeding another mouth from the scraps her children survived on. Her herbs were nearly gone, only a few dried leaves left for fevers. If she gave them to this stranger, what would save her children should sickness come? Her hands shook. She glanced back at the cabin, faint in the blur of snow. Caleb, trying to be strong, Mary trying to smile. They were all she had. A voice inside her whispered, "Leave him. The wind will finish what was begun." But then another, in William's tone, rose in her mind. "Eleanor, a man must not be left to die in the storm." The wind tore at her shawl, sent her hair whipping loose. Eleanor bit down on her lip, chest tight with the weight of the choice. He was no kin, no friend, just a stranger. But perhaps that was why her conscience refused to turn away. Sliding her arms beneath his, she pulled. His body was heavy, near twice her size, but she set her teeth and bore down with the strength of shoulders long trained by work in the fields. Each step drove her deeper into snow, the gale shoving her frail frame, yet she dragged him inch by inch toward the glow of the cabin's lamplight. Every pace burned her lungs raw, but at last their shadows crossed the doorway. Inside, Caleb and Mary gasped to see their mother hauling a lifeless man. Mary cried out, "Mother, is he alive?" Eleanor did not answer at once. She lowered him by the fire, pressed her ear against his chest. A weak, stubborn rhythm still beat. In that moment she knew her choice was made, though it might draw danger to every soul in her house. The fire sputtered, throwing restless shadows along the gray, weather-worn walls. Eleanor strained to ease the man down onto a threadbare rug. His breath still dragged through, but heavy, ragged, like a torn bellows. Caleb and Mary pressed themselves into the corner, eyes wide, filled with both wonder and fear. Mary's lips trembled as she turned to her mother with pleading eyes. "Mother, save him. Don't let him die." Eleanor felt her chest tighten. She knew the medicine chest held little more than a few sage leaves and scraps of bitter bark William had once used for coughs. That was all. To spend it now on a stranger meant her family would have nothing left to stand against the long winter ahead. Yet Mary's eyes, clear and earnest, the very eyes her father once had, left her powerless to turn away. She fetched a pot of water, dropped the last of the herbs in, and set it over the fire. A bitter, sharp scent filled the room, stinging her nose, but it was the only chance of warding off rot in the wound. Eleanor tore strips from an old shirt, washed them in warm water, and turned back to the stranger. Her hand trembled as she pressed the scissors to his thick coat, cutting layer by layer of stiffened fabric. Beneath, she uncovered a ragged wound near his left chest. Blood clotted tight against the skin. She bit down hard, pressing a cloth to stem the flow. The man groaned faintly, but did not wake. As she stripped away another layer, her hand struck something hard. Frowning, Eleanor reached inside his coat. Her fingers touched cold metal. She drew it out, a silver badge. In the firelight, the faint letters U.S. Marshal appeared, but scarred, gouged across as if someone had deliberately clawed the surface to ruin it. The five-pointed star itself was scoured and marred. Caleb's eyes widened. "Mother, he's a federal lawman?" Mary pressed close, whispering urgently. "Then why is he hurt? Who would do this?" Eleanor said nothing. Her mind churned. If he was truly a marshal, who had tried to erase his mark? Was he ambushed, betrayed by his own? And if he was not a marshal at all, why carry a false badge? The cold of the metal seeped into her palm, all the way to her heart. William's old warnings rose in memory, about outlaws posing as men of law to fool settlers, about purges that spared no one. Her gaze fell to her children, innocent yet, blind to the danger crouching near. She slipped the badge into her own pocket, determined they would not carry that burden. Carefully, she cleaned the wound with the hot herbal water. The stench of blood mingled with the sharp sage, stifling in the small cabin. The stranger stirred, lips moving in broken whispers. "Blackwood. The files. Don't let him." The words rasped, weak and terrified. Eleanor leaned close, her pulse quickening. Blackwood. The name was known in Bitter Creek. Marcus Blackwood, master of the largest spread in the valley, as rich as he was, ruthless. Folks whispered he held the government itself in his pocket, willing to do anything to seize more land. Eleanor sank back hard, her mind reeling. This man bore a marshal's badge, defaced and hidden, and muttered of Blackwood and some file. If he was truly an officer of the law, he carried something Blackwood feared. If not, perhaps she had dragged a wolf into her own den. At the hearth, Caleb fed more wood to the flames, glancing at his mother's tense face. He asked softly, "Mother, should we tell the sheriff?" Eleanor lifted her eyes, met his steady gaze. He was trying to be grown, but she knew fear throbbed beneath. Sheriff Miller might take the man away, might free them of the burden, but it would also bind them to a fight whose ending none could see. And if Blackwood truly lay behind it, could Miller stand against him? Eleanor did not answer. Instead, she wound the bandages tight around the stranger's chest, staunching what blood she could. His breathing steadied, though faint. Outside, the storm still howled, but inside the cabin, the air grew heavier, suffocating. Mary hugged her knees, staring at the man's still form. She whispered, almost to herself, "If he were bad, why would he be lying here, hurt so bad?" Eleanor turned away, unable to answer. William's voice echoed again in her mind. In this West, the line between good men and bad is often no wider than a single bullet. The fire cracked, throwing its light across the man's face. A broad brow, a hard jaw, brows furrowed even in unconsciousness. A man who had known power, or carried a burden few could bear. Eleanor studied him, uneasy, yet stirred by the gravity of his presence. In her pocket, the silver badge burned like a brand. It was proof of something, some truth that could drag her family into ruin. Yet she knew she could no longer cast him out. The choice had been made when she pulled him from the storm, and from that moment, the course of her life, of Caleb's and Mary's, had shifted onto a path they could never turn from. That night, Eleanor did not sleep. She sat by the fire, listening to the storm batter the walls, to the stranger's faint groans fading in and out. Each time his breath caught, she feared it would be his last. And always, she saw again Mary's eyes, the pleading gaze that had stayed her hand. Eleanor knew then, from this night on, it would no longer be just three of them fighting the winter. They had opened their door to a secret, and that secret wore the bloodied shape of a man, with a scarred marshal's badge and broken words of Blackwood. By the firelight, she whispered to herself, "Lord, let me not be wrong." Dawn in Bitter Creek never came warm. Even when the sun strained to pierce the heavy clouds, its light was a pale, colorless smear across the patchwork of snow. Eleanor opened her eyes under the weight of exhaustion. She had sat the whole night through, watching the stranger's breath falter and rise, sometimes strong, sometimes perilously weak. At the first hint of morning, she rose, stretching, her back aching as though struck by iron hammers. On the wooden table lay the ledger from the Bitter Creek bank, plain as an accusation. Eleanor reached for it and turned to the last page. The handwriting was sharp and pitiless. 3 months remaining. If unpaid, the land will be seized. 3 months. In other years, a good corn harvest or a few calves brought to market would have been enough to manage. But this year was not like the others. William was gone. The farm had been left untended through autumn as she nursed him in his fevers, and now only barren furrows and weeds remained. The 3 head of cattle were skin and bone, their hides dull, hardly fit to last the winter. Eleanor bit her lip, her hand whitening on the book. A sound stirred in the kitchen. She turned to see Caleb bent over the hearth. He wore his father's old coat, now too short, the sleeves ending at his elbows. He clumsily fed scraps of wood into the stove, his breath puffing white in the cold. Mary had woken too, curled in the corner, her tiny hands working a needle awkwardly through the sole of an old shoe. The sight cut into Eleanor like a blade. A poor breakfast, children forced into labor beyond their years. She ladled the thin gruel into bowls, little more than boiled scraps of potato, gray and tasteless, and set them before her children. Mary forced a smile, whispering, "It's good, Mama." Caleb said nothing, only ate in silence, though his eyes flickered now and again to the ledger on the table. He knew what it meant, though he pretended not to ask. Eleanor recognized that look, a boy forced to grow older than his years, longing to carry burdens his hands had no strength to lift. Outside, the wind whistled through the cracks, carrying the sting of ice. Eleanor drew a long breath, as though swallowing her fears to hide them from her children. As they sat around their thin bowls of gruel, a faint groan rose from the corner. The stranger stirred, his face twisted with pain. Eleanor rose at once, adjusting the bandage at his chest. The bleeding had stopped, but his skin burned with fever. She laid another blanket over him, but dread gnawed at her. If he died here under her roof, what would become of them? Would the sheriff believe her or see her as complicit? Sighing, Eleanor sank into her chair and opened the ledger once more, her eyes fixed on the numbers. In her mind, she saw Mr. Kramer, the bank manager, cold eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, his voice steady and unyielding. "Rules are rules, Mrs. Whitmore. 3 months more. If payment is not made, we seize the land." When William lived, he had stood between her and that man, speaking with dignity, holding their pride intact. But now Eleanor stood alone. To the bank she was nothing but a widow, frail, easy to corner into selling for pennies. The thought closed her throat tight. Caleb set down his spoon and spoke suddenly. "I can cut more wood. Take it to town and sell. Folks need fire through winter. I can help you pay the debt." Eleanor looked at him. Pride and pain collided in her chest. He was only 11, an age to be learning his letters, to ride freely, not to worry over banknotes. She laid her hand on his shoulder and shook her head gently. "You are still a child. That burden is mine." Caleb pressed his lips shut, but his eyes shone with a spark, his father's same unyielding will. He said no more, only drained his bowl and pulled on his coat, preparing to gather more wood. Mary worked patiently on her shoe, her little fingers raw from the cold, but making no complaint. Eleanor stroked her daughter's hair, aching with love too sharp to bear. In that moment Eleanor understood. Poverty did not only gnaw at the belly, it stole the childhood from her children. And should the bank seize their land, they would be cast out into the snow, with nowhere to lay their heads. She closed the ledger and hid it away in the cupboard, but its shadow still hung thick over the room, heavier than the smoke from the stove. Every act, the morning meal, the scraps of wood, even the sound of their own breathing, fell beneath that shadow, a reminder that 3 months was all they had. Her eyes strayed back to the stranger. He lay fevered still, shivering under the quilts. She could not know if saving him meant ruin or redemption. Yet deep inside, Eleanor sensed his presence would bind itself to their fate, for better or worse. Outside, the storm relented, letting through the wan sun. Its pale light filtered through the cracks, glinting off the ledger on the table, the black ink stark and unforgiving. Eleanor sat for hours, her eyes heavy, her mind a ceaseless cry. How can I keep the land? How can I keep a home for my children? The morning passed in silence, yet for Eleanor it weighed heavier than the storm of the night before. For storms pass and snow melts. But the shadow of the bank, the shadow of debt, remained, gnawing away at hope with every hour, threatening to strip a widow and her children of the little they still possessed. The little cabin was steeped in the damp scent of herbs, smoke from the hearth mingling with the fragile warmth that crept out from the stove. Eleanor sat beside the stranger, her eyes heavy with fatigue, yet fixed with care. Her hands moved steadily, changing bandages, wiping sweat from his brow. His body shifted between chills like ice and heat, like burning coals. Each time she laid a warm cloth against his chest, his lips spilled broken murmurs. "Double cross. The files. Don't. Let Blackwood." The words fell like knocks against a locked door. Eleanor frowned, her heart tightening. Blackwood's name once more. Even whispered in delirium, it was enough to chill her bones. Mary sat nearby, her round eyes wide with curiosity. To her, men had always been strong, like her father once was. Yet this man trembled, gasped, drenched in sweat. Something about that weakness drew her closer. When Eleanor rose to fetch water from the stove, Mary edged forward, Her small hands slipped into the stranger's blood-stiffened coat. Her fingers brushed something hard, rough. She pulled it free, gasping. A folded paper, soaked, streaked with dried blood. "Mama," Mary called softly. Eleanor turned, saw what her daughter held. She hurried over, her breath catching. A crumpled paper, blotched with dark stains. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was a map. Beneath the dried blood, rough lines emerged, twisting trails, mountain ridges, streams, and a red cross circled heavy. At the corner, a few words still legible. Silver Creek Mine. Eleanor's heart jolted. She knew the name. Silver Creek, once a booming silver mine, until a cave-in buried scores of miners alive. Folks still claimed their cries echoed in the mountain at night. Since then, no one dared venture near. Caleb, hearing the stir, rushed over. His eyes lit when he saw it. "Mother, isn't that the silver mine up north? If there's still silver there, we could—" Eleanor pressed her finger to his lips. "Hush. Don't say such things." Her gaze flicked to the stranger, still tossing in fever. His lips moved again, whispering, "The files. Evidence. Blackwood." The map trembled in Eleanor's hand. This was no child's game. A bloodied scrap carried weight. Evidence of something greater. Something worth dying to protect. And with Blackwood's name entwined, it was surely a piece of some dangerous design. Mary, innocent, tilted her head. "Is he looking for treasure, Mama?" Eleanor did not answer. Fear surged within her, cold and swift. If secrets lay hidden in Silver Creek Mine, then this man's collapse on her doorstep was no accident. She and her children had been swept into it the moment she dragged him from the storm. She folded the map quickly and shoved it into a kitchen drawer. Turning to her children, her voice was sharp with command. "No one speaks of this, not to anyone. Do you understand?" Caleb nodded hard. Mary, hesitant, nodded too, though their eyes still glimmered with the spark of curiosity. Eleanor returned to the stranger's side, unease pressing into her chest. She remembered the scratched marshal's badge she had hidden away the night before. Now, paired with this blood-stained map, the questions multiplied. Marshal or imposter? Witness or outlaw? Her hand rested against his chest, feeling the faint beat of his heart. She glanced at her children by the fire, their small hands stretched toward the warmth. Their lives hung by a thread. One wrong choice and they could all be dragged into a pit with no bottom. Outside, the wind still swept across Bitter Creek, but within the cabin, silence grew thicker still. Eleanor knew since the moment Mary pulled that bloodied map from his coat, nothing was simple anymore. A door had opened, one that led into Blackwood's world, into secrets buried deep within the Silver Mountain, where law and greed tangled in shadow. She closed her eyes, drew a deep breath. In the darkness behind her lids, William's face rose, his steady gaze, his rough, kind hand. "You must be strong, Eleanor. You must protect the children." Opening her eyes, she looked toward the drawer where the map now lay hidden. Whether she willed it or not, the man had brought a turning point into her home. And that blood-stained scrap of paper might well be the reason Blackwood wanted him erased from Bitter Creek. Outside, the sky hung heavy and gray. A curtain draped across the valley. The storm had passed, but another, more dangerous, more secret, was gathering within the little cabin where a widow and her children clung to survival. 3 heavy days had passed. The storm over Bitter Creek had weakened, snow now blanketing the rooftops in silence. Yet inside the little cabin, the true tempest lay beneath the quilts where the stranger battled for life. Eleanor scarcely closed her eyes, tending the bandages, cooling his fevered skin, guarding every breath. Caleb kept the stove alive in quiet diligence, while Mary rarely left her post near the bedside, her wide eyes fixed on the stranger's face with tireless curiosity. On the third morning, when the pale light of dawn slid through the cracks of the shutters, a rasping cough broke the hush. Eleanor started, turning sharply. The man's eyes were open, faint, weary, but conscious at last. His lips moved, his voice low and ragged with weakness. "Where am I?" Eleanor's tone was guarded, her hand still gripping the small kitchen knife she had been using on kindling, a reflex she could not dismiss. "You're in Bitter Creek. You collapsed out on the field. My children and I brought you in." The man exhaled, as though recalling fragments. His gaze roamed the rough-hewn walls, the wavering firelight. The two children crouched close to their mother. A faint smile crept at the corner of his mouth. "Thank you. Without you, I'd have died out there." Eleanor's face remained hard, her eyes narrowing, searching him as though to pry truth from his silence. At length, he spoke again, voice steadier. "My name is Jonas Hale. I'm just a farmer, owner of a small place up north. A small farm." The words repeated in Eleanor's mind, yet the hollow in her chest deepened at the false ring of it. The way he held her gaze, the clipped but resolute speech, the very way he forced himself upright, all carried the weight of a man schooled in steel and fire, not one tied only to furrows and cattle. Caleb edged closer, curiosity brimming. He held out his little whittling knife, dulled from years of boyish carving. "Do you know how to use this?" Jonas studied the blade, then the scrap of wood in Caleb's hand. Though weak, he accepted it, his fingers sure. With a few deft strokes, the knife cut cleaner than Caleb had ever managed. Slowly, he carved a simple bird from the block. Caleb's mouth fell open in awe. "See?" Jonas murmured with a faint smile, handing it back. "It's not about strength. You have to feel the grain, let it guide the knife." Caleb nodded, rapt, admiration gleaming in his eyes, a light Eleanor had not seen there in months. Mary, clutching the family's worn Bible, asked timidly, "Would you like me to read to you?" Jonas blinked, surprised, then nodded. The girl's voice wavered, halting over words, yet it carried warmth. Jonas closed his eyes, listening as though the verses stirred some memory long buried. His lips quivered faintly, the shadow of remembrance passing across his face. Eleanor sat watching in silence. In the span of a single morning, this man, whose truth she had yet to grasp, had slipped into the rhythm of her household, as though he belonged. Caleb leaned to him as though to a father's guidance. Mary found in him a patient listener. And Eleanor herself, she felt, if only briefly, the vast emptiness William had left begin to fill. At once she scolded her own heart. She could not allow weakness. The scratched marshal's badge, the blood-stained map, the fevered whispers of Blackwood, all hung heavy still. This man might be a blessing or a curse. Jonas sipped from the cup of herbal water, then spoke softly, almost to break the weight of silence. "I owe your family my life. Whoever I am, I'll repay it." Eleanor's reply was sharp, her eyes cold. "What we need is the truth, not promises." Jonas paused, faintly startled, then gave a thin, weary smile. He said no more, only lay back, eyes drifting to the ceiling, retreating into silence. That afternoon, the wind rose once more beyond the walls, but inside a different current moved. Caleb carved wood with new focus under Jonas's quiet counsel. Mary read aloud with more certainty, as if filling a long, empty space, and Eleanor, sewing at the table, found her eyes straying, catching his gaze across the room, a gaze layered with gratitude and with secrets. When night fell, the house lay in stillness, yet Eleanor remained wakeful, her eyes on Jonas as he slept. The fire cast its light across his features, strong brow, firm jaw, scars faint along his cheek, the marks of a life far from peace. Inside her, two forces wrestled, the unfamiliar warmth of seeing her children cling to him, and the choking dread of the secrets he carried. She knew it had been but 3 days, yet Jonas Hale's presence had already changed the air of the household, and sooner or later, the truth he bore would force her to face it. Evening sank slow, the gray sky pressing low over Bitter Creek. From the narrow window, Eleanor saw the snow had ceased, leaving a haze of dim air, yellow light fading like a lamp about to die. Caleb had just stacked wood in the corner, while Mary sat reading from the Bible to Jonas. Outwardly, it was a quiet scene, yet unease gnawed sharp within Eleanor's chest. Then came the sound, hooves, steady, unhurried, the gait of men who knew they held the advantage. Eleanor stiffened, eyes darting to the window. 3 riders emerged along the snow-packed trail, their cloaks snapping in the bitter wind. Each sat astride a tall horse, the dull gleam of iron at their holsters. Beside her, Jonas tensed. His hand pressed against the bed frame as though to rise, but he mastered himself, staying silent, his gaze locked on the figures drawing near. The hoofbeats halted at the door. A knock followed, hard, hollow, like a hammer striking a coffin. Eleanor drew breath, clenched her fists, and went to answer. 3 men stood there, their faces hidden by scarves, only cold eyes showing. The foremost, broad-shouldered, spoke in a gravel voice. "Ma'am, we're looking for an outlaw. Tall, wore a black coat, rode a fine horse, badly wounded. Have you seen anyone suspicious nearby?" Eleanor held her voice steady, though her pulse thundered. Her mind leapt to Jonas in the back room, wounds unhealed. For a heartbeat she faltered, then forced the lie. "Only me and the children here. In a storm like this, no one would dare wander the road." The man's eyes narrowed, scanning every corner of the humble cabin behind her. His gaze lingered a beat too long on Caleb's boots by the door, the mud not yet dried, but he said nothing. At last he gave a curt nod. "If you see anything, tell the sheriff. That man's dangerous." He weighted the word dangerous, as though leaving a curse on the threshold. The riders turned their mounts and rode away, slow and deliberate. Still, Eleanor felt the prickling on her back, as if their suspicion clung like a shadow. When the door shut, her breath rushed free. But in the room, Jonas had already pushed himself upright, pale as chalk. His hand trembled against his brow. "They weren't the sheriff's men. They belonged to Blackwood." Eleanor spun, eyes sharp. "You know them? Who are you truly?" Jonas was silent a moment, caught between falsehood and confession. Yet Eleanor's gaze, unyielding, demanding, left no escape. "I am not just a farmer," Jonas said at last, weary. "I own Double Cross Ranch." The name fell heavy. It was no stranger to her ears. Double Cross had once been one of the grandest spreads north of Bitter Creek, hundreds of acres, a horse string famous clear across Colorado. But rumors had spread for months, its master wounded, its land ripe for Marcus Blackwood's taking. Eleanor froze. Her mind leapt to the silver-trimmed saddle marked with an H, to the marshal's badge scarred and hidden to the blood-stained map. The fragments drew together into a grim shape. "Why did you lie to me?" she whispered, her voice quivering with both anger and fear. Jonas braced his weight on his knees, struggling upright, weariness carved deep in his face. "Because the truth would drag you and your children into peril. Blackwood has long hungered for Double Cross. He offered me his price. I refused. Since then, disaster has followed. The fire in the stables, the men abandoning me, the death of my best stallion. This wound," he touched his chest, "was his last message. Sell or die with it." Eleanor's skin chilled. Blackwood, the name Bitter Creek folk whispered with dread, now loomed like a specter crouched upon her doorstep. "And the badge?" she pressed, eyes fixed sharp. "Why did you carry it? Why was it defaced?" Jonas was silent, then answered slow. "My twin brother was a marshal. The badge was his. But I'll tell you more, in time. This is not the hour." It was no full answer, yet his eyes did not bear the mark of a liar. They were the eyes of a man hounded, holding back truths too raw to speak. Outside, hoofbeats faded into the mountains, leaving their prints deep in the snow. But the shadow of Blackwood had already crossed the threshold, thick as the cold itself. Jonas closed his eyes briefly, voice low as a vow. "If I survive, Blackwood will not stop. You saved me. Now he will have marked you too. From this moment, our fates are bound together." Eleanor sat rigid, her hands clenching her skirt. She could not know if she had rescued a savior or invited ruin. Yet one truth lay bare. From the instant Jonas Hale revealed his name, life for her and her children would never be as it was. The wind screamed at the eaves, flinging snow in violent gusts. In the gray sky, the three riders still haunted her mind, their trail cut deep. And within the cabin, the first truth stood clear. The stranger was not merely a wounded man from the storm, but Jonas Hale, master of Double Cross Ranch, locked in mortal struggle with Marcus Blackwood. That afternoon, the sky over Bitter Creek darkened so swiftly, it seemed the light had been snuffed out by unseen hands. Black clouds coiled into a vast whirl, rolling like a bloodthirsty beast descending upon the valley. Wind howled, tearing up sheets of snow, lashing ice across the face like a whip. Eleanor was at the well, scrubbing rags, when she heard it, the strange whistle, not of common wind, but a keening that seemed to echo from the mountain's heart. Looking up, she saw the cloud spiral touch the earth in the distance. Her chest seized. She cried out, voice cutting through the gale. "Caleb! Mary! Into the house! Now!" The children started from their play near the barn, but before they could run far, Jonas burst from the porch, pointing toward the livestock shelter. "If we don't brace it, the storm will tear it apart." Eleanor followed his gaze. The barn sagged, beams loose and swaying. One hard gust could bring it down. Inside, the three gaunt cattle and the old mule, the family's last wealth, stamped and bellowed, eyes rolling white. If the shelter fell, they would be lost, and with them every hope for survival. Eleanor gave a sharp nod. Without hesitation, she and Jonas, with the children close behind, raced toward the barn. The gale buffeted them, staggering their steps, snow blinding as a shroud drawn tight across their path. "Caleb, hold that door fast!" Jonas roared above the storm. "Mary, fetch every rope from that chest, quick!" The children, pale with fear, obeyed. Eleanor and Jonas braced their shoulders against the shuddering doors. Hinges shrieked, ready to rip free. "Rope the beam!" Jonas shouted, straining. "Now, tight as you can!" Eleanor's hands trembled, fingers numb with cold, but she forced them to work, biting her lip until it bled. Jonas leaned beside her, his grip sure, his knots fierce. The rope groaned but held. Through the maelstrom, Eleanor stole a glance. Jonas's hair whipped wild, his face drawn with pain, yet his eyes burned steady, intent. In that instant, she saw not a half-dead stranger, but a man forged to stand against storm and trial. Caleb bent low, his small frame straining against the door, shoulders shaking with the effort. Jonas moved beside him, shoulder to shoulder, man and boy, bound as if they had always known each other. Mary stumbled back with more rope, tears streaming, but her hands never stopped moving. "That's it, lad," Jonas bellowed to Caleb. "Don't let go, you can do this." A few words only, but Caleb's eyes shone, strength renewed. The whirlwind bore down, its roar like 100 trains bearing down at once. The earth trembled. The barn shook, rafters groaning, planks tearing free and spinning into the white void. Yet the main beams held, pressed upright by 4 bodies clinging with all their might. Time itself seemed to halt. Eleanor could not tell if the wet on her face was snow, sweat, or tears. She only felt Jonas's breath, near her ear, his hand firm on her shoulder, anchoring her as though the world itself might split. Then, as sudden as its coming, the twister veered skyward, spiraling back into the clouds, leaving behind a silence so sharp it rang in the ears. The wind fell still, the ground steadied, only the ragged panting of 4 souls and the frantic bawl of livestock remained. Eleanor collapsed to her knees in the snow, lungs heaving. Jonas slumped beside her, blood seeping fresh through his bandages. Caleb and Mary sank down too, clinging together, trembling. When Eleanor turned to Jonas, she no longer saw only a wounded burden. He had thrown his strength against the storm for her, for Caleb, for Mary, binding them together in that desperate moment as something closer than strangers. For an instant, she felt William's presence in the gale, whispering, "You are not alone anymore." Jonas gave a faint, weary smile, lips tinged with blue. We stood against the storm. Eleanor held his gaze a long moment. She did not answer, but her eyes softened. A fragile trust had taken root within her, a trust that this man, though he carried danger at his heels, might also be the shoulder she could lean on when the winds rose again. After the fury of the twister, the cabin itself trembled as though it might splinter to dust. Jonas, Eleanor, and the 2 children dared not remain upstairs. They gathered blankets, candles, a few scraps of dried food, and descended into the cellar beneath the house. It was a low, narrow space, damp with the smell of earth, thick with the scent of old hay. Candlelight flickered against the rough walls, shadows stretching long and restless like ghosts. Caleb clutched Mary in his arms, both still shaking from the storm's wrath. Eleanor leaned against the dirt wall, weary, yet her eyes remained fixed on Jonas. Silent now, hunched, his hand gripping his knee, breath ragged. At last, he broke the silence. "I owe you a truth, Eleanor." His voice was hoarse, drained. I am not only the master of double cross. I once had a home, a family, but it has been gone a long time. Eleanor straightened, brows knitting. Jonas lifted his gaze, lost to some far horizon. My wife's name was Clara. She came from the east, gentle, fond of roses. I promised her a wide country of sunlit skies. I built double cross for her, every fence post, every beam raised for that vow. His voice faltered, sank. But in the summer of 71, fever swept through Bitter Creek. She fell ill. In a week, Clara was gone. Since then, Double Cross has been an empty shell. The candlelight caught the lines of grief carved into his face. Eleanor was struck still. His loss mirrored her own. The winter William had left her forever. A grief that never announces itself, always stealing half a life when it comes. Mary squeezed her mother's hand, sensing something in his words. Caleb sat silent, eyes fixed on the ground, his fists clenched white around his knees. Jonas's tone grew heavier. Marcus Blackwood saw my weakness. He offered to buy Double Cross, to fold it into his empire of land. I refused. That ground is not only soil, it is Clara's grave. It is the vow I swore. His eyes glinted in the flame. He would not accept. Since then, calamity after calamity. Hired men bought off, horses poisoned, fire in the granary. And then this wound. His hand pressed his chest. His final message. Sell or die. Above, the storm's wind moaned through cracks in the timbers, as though lending voice to his tale. Eleanor's chest constricted. She knew too well the terror of being cornered, life bound to the land and to memories that could never be abandoned. Silence held the cellar for long moments. Then Caleb lifted his head, eyes glinting in the candlelight. In his hand he held a crumpled sheet, found in the shadows of the cellar. Mother, Mr. Jonas, what is this? Eleanor's breath caught. Jonas turned, his face tightening. Caleb's small hands held the paper high. The candlelight revealed the bold letters, Wanted. Beneath it, a stern sketch of a man's face. And the name in heavy print, Jonas Hale. Eleanor paled. The room seemed to sway. Mary whimpered, clutching her mother. Caleb's voice trembled, torn between fear and anger. You lied to us? You're a wanted man? Jonas was still. He took the sheet from the boy, fingers trembling as he traced the lines of the sketch. Slowly, he raised his head, his voice gravel. Yes, that says Jonas Hale, but it is not me. Eleanor's voice was sharp, strained. What do you mean? Jonas met her eyes, steady, unflinching. I have a twin brother. His name is Jared. He wears my face, but not my heart. He sold out our parents. He sold out me. To Blackwood. His grip tightened on the poster, his voice lowering like a stone falling deep. Blackwood needed a puppet among the Hales to legitimize his claim on Double Cross. Jared offered himself. He signed debts in my name, forged evidence, and when I resisted, he sent Blackwood's men to ambush me. This wound, he touched his chest, their last message, you are no longer master of Double Cross. The wind above seemed to change, moaning like a dirge. Eleanor swayed with the revelation. Yet in his eyes she saw it. The naked truth, not the cunning of an outlaw, but the wound of a man betrayed by his own blood. Caleb's face was tight, torn between belief and doubt. He looked from the paper to Jonas, back again. At last, seeing the tremor in Jonas's lips, the pain carved into his gaze, the boy lowered the sheet and whispered, "Your own brother did this?" Jonas bowed his head, shoulders heavy. "Yes, and now he stands with Blackwood. He wants me gone, so he can be Jonas Hale in the eyes of the world." Eleanor's spine prickled cold. Another storm had risen, not of wind, but of betrayal. Her voice came low, taut. "Then it isn't only Blackwood we face. It is your own blood." Jonas's eyes sank, his voice breaking. "Yes, and that is why I cannot surrender. Double Cross is not only land. It is honor, it is justice. It is where Clara rests. I will take it back, even if it costs me my life." In the damp dark, Eleanor studied him. Fear did not loosen in her, but alongside it bloomed a sharp kinship. She knew loss, but betrayal by one's own kin, that was a wound deeper than death. The candle shivered, its light carving their shadows against the walls. A widow, 2 children, and a man scarred in body and in soul. Bound now by a fate none of them had chosen, and in the boy's trembling hands, the wanted poster sealed their bond tighter still, the proof of blood-borne treachery that none could escape. The night in Bitter Creek lay still, broken only by the thin whine of wind slipping through the cracks. Eleanor had just drifted into sleep when a strange, acrid smell struck her nose. She jolted upright, heart hammering. From the window, a red glare lit the horizon, a streak of fire racing across the dry grass. "Fire!" Eleanor cried, her voice breaking. Jonas lurched awake, nearly collapsing from his wound, but staggered to the door. Outside, flames surged like serpents, devouring earth and brush, black smoke climbing the sky in blood-red columns. And on the distant ridge the silhouettes of riders moved, Blackwood's men. "He means to burn it all!" Jonas snarled, fury flashing in his eyes. A gunshot cracked. A bullet ripped through the roof, splinters showering down. Mary screamed, clinging to her mother. Caleb froze, his young face rigid, but behind his fear a spark of rage flared bright. "To the barn!" Jonas shouted. "Thicker walls, we can hold there!" They rushed through smoke and embers. Jonas seized William's old hunting rifle and pressed it into Eleanor's hands. He himself drew a Colt revolver from the cupboard, rusted but still faithful. Inside the barn, the smell of hay mixed with choking smoke. Caleb clutched the ammunition box. Mary held trembling hands over the powder tin. Their eyes turned to their mother, afraid, yet steady. Eleanor gripped the rifle, her fingers, made for thread and needle, trembling around the cold steel. "Listen to me, children." She knelt, her voice firm. "When I fire, Caleb reloads. Mary, you bring the powder. No tears, no hesitation. Do you understand?" Both nodded hard, lips pale but determined. Hooves thundered outside, followed by another volley of gunfire. Bullets punched through the walls, sending splinters flying. Jonas fired through a gap, the Colt's bark echoing, drawing curses from the riders. Eleanor held her breath, raised the rifle, and waited. A shadow drew near, torch in hand. Eleanor squeezed the trigger. The shot thundered. The man fell, his flame dying in the mud. Smoke filled the barn, her ears ringing. Caleb shoved another cartridge into her hand, his small fingers shaking but steady. Mary thrust the powder forward, eyes wet but fierce. Eleanor bit her lip, reloaded. Her movements, clumsy at first, grew surer. She fired again, then again. Each shot tore her heart, yet also fed a fire within. She was no longer only the widow Whitmore. but a mother fierce and unyielding, ready to fight for her children and her home. Outside, Blackwood's men multiplied, their shouts mingling with the roar of fire. The wind drove the flames closer, painting the riders in hellish red, their silhouettes like demons on horseback. Jonas's revolver barked until empty. He dropped low to reload, sweat and blood soaking his shirt. "Hold fast!" he bellowed. "Don't let them near!" A bullet tore through the roof, landing in a pile of hay. Flames leapt. Mary screamed, but Caleb snatched a wet blanket and smothered it, beating the fire down. Jonas gave him a fierce nod, pride flashing through his pain. Then from beyond the fields came fresh gunfire, voices shouting. Sheriff Miller and townsfolk had arrived. "Hold steady, Whitmore! We're with you!" Hope sparked, but the enemy pressed thick. Gunshots rained against the barn walls, the storm of hooves unrelenting. Eleanor's shoulder throbbed from the rifle's kick, her arms trembling, but she loaded and fired again. Caleb's hands moved faster now. Mary coughed from the smoke but did not falter. For a heartbeat in the chaos, Eleanor glanced at Jonas. He fought like a man aflame, his face taut with pain, eyes blazing. In that moment, amid smoke and fire, she no longer saw him as the burden she had dragged from the snow, but as her comrade, her stronghold. Gunfire, shouts, and the cries of frightened beasts fused into one cacophony, a vision of hell itself. Yet within it, Eleanor felt a strange strength rise. It came from the bond forged here, Caleb's trembling courage, Mary's stubborn will, Jonas's fire. The night of fire was far from over, but Eleanor knew this much. Her family was no longer three lonely souls fighting hunger and cold. They had stepped into a greater battle, one from which there would be no turning back. Gunfire split the night wide open, smoke and scorched grass thickening the air until every breath was heavy as lead. The stable shuddered beneath the storm of bullets, riddled walls letting in wind and firelight from outside. Eleanor steadied her shoulder, fired another shot, though her hands trembled with exhaustion. Caleb shoved another cartridge into her palm, and Mary, eyes brimming with tears, clung to the powder horn, her tiny fingers blackened with soot. Jonas leaned against the timber beam, loading as he gasped for breath. Sweat and blood ran down his chest, and then a hoarse cry tore from him as a bullet ripped through his left shoulder, hurling him to the dirt floor. Eleanor lunged for him, but he thrust out a hand to stop her. Don't mind me. Keep firing." He forced himself upright long enough to fire one more round before collapsing. "Mr. Jonas!" Caleb cried. Outside, Blackwood's riders roared with triumph. Hooves pounded, their voices savage. "The strong one's down! Finish 'em! Burn it all!" Eleanor clutched her gun, eyes darting to her children. Despair cut deep, sharper than any blade. She knew it would only be minutes before fire and steel consumed them all. But then, through the lull between volleys, came another sound. Hoofbeats. Not a handful, but dozens, thunder rolling across the earth. The ground trembled beneath them. Iron shoes rang against frozen soil, rising like a storm of their own. Eleanor's heart leapt. Caleb held his breath. Mary squeezed her mother's hand. From the haze of smoke and snow, a tide of riders broke through, guns aloft, voices thundering. Faces she knew, men who had once worked double cross, who Jonas thought had abandoned him. But here they came, loyalty burning bright in their eyes. "For double cross!" Their cry shook the valley, louder than gunfire itself. Blackwood's men faltered. The riders crashed into their ranks, pistols flashing, horses shrieking. Steel clashed, hooves churned mud and flame. Half of Blackwood's force fell in moments, the rest scattered in panic. Sheriff Miller led townsfolk forward, seizing the chance to strike. The battlefield turned. Fire lit the chaos, horses rearing, men shouting, guns cracking, smoke rolling thick as midnight fog. Inside the stable, Eleanor dragged Jonas upright. He forced his eyes open, a ragged smile breaking through the blood. "They still believe in me." Eleanor tightened her grip on his hand, then wheeled back toward the door. She fired, felling a rider about to cast fire upon the roof. Caleb pressed fresh rounds into her hands. Mary wiped the sweat from Jonas's brow. In the frenzy, they moved as one, family and stranger, bound as if they had always been so. The gunfight raged on, but Blackwood's men weakened. The riders of Double Cross drove them back. Fire smoldered to ash, and the groans of the beaten lingered in place of battle cries. Then, through the haze came a shadow she knew too well. Marcus Blackwood rode forward, cloak billowing, wide brim hat shading half his face, eyes glinting cold as stone. He did not reach for his gun. He only clapped, slow and sharp, a smile thin as a knife. "Jonas Hale, still alive, and lucky enough to summon back the traitors." Jonas, shoulders soaked in blood, stood tall as a pillar. His voice roared hoarse yet steady. "This ain't luck, it's loyalty, the one thing you'll never buy." Blackwood laughed, but his mirth died when a double-cross rider surged forward, ripping him from the saddle. Sheriff Miller bound him fast in hemp rope before his fingers brushed steel. Cheers rang out, shaking the night, drowning the crackle of dying flames. But just as the crowd thought it done, another voice cut the smoke. "Loyalty? To die for a rotting ranch?" Eleanor froze. Caleb and Mary clutched close. Jonas turned, eyes wide. Out of the darkness walked a man. His face Jonas's mirror, save for eyes hard with cruelty and a sneer that cut deep. "Jared," Jonas whispered, voice broken. His twin, the brother who sold them out. Jared pulled off his gloves, slow and deliberate, then stepped beside the bound Blackwood, bowing lightly as though greeting an equal. His voice rang cold. "Brother, you've never learned. Times have changed. Honor doesn't fill a man's belly. I chose the wiser road." Jonas staggered, his eyes ablaze with grief and fury. Eleanor felt his breath ragged at her side, as though the wound in his heart bled worse than the one in his flesh. Sheriff Miller leveled his revolver, but Jonas lifted a trembling hand. "Leave him. This is mine." In the glow of dying fire, the two men faced each other, alike as reflections, yet worlds apart. One scarred, broken, yet unbowed in honor. The other unmarked, standing straight, yet chained to greed. The battlefield fell silent, as though the very earth waited for the reckoning. Spring came slow to Bitter Creek, but in 1875 the valley wore a different face. The snow pulled back to reveal rich black soil, tender grass creeping across the hills where fire had once devoured the earth. Along the little creek, water murmured over stone, mingling with the song of hatchlings, heralds of a new beginning. On land once smothered in gunsmoke, the Double Cross Ranch stirred back to life. Riders who had deserted now returned, hammering posts, mending roofs, planting seed in scorched furrows. Townsfolk, too, once wary, came with tools and strong backs, as if repaying the debt borne from that night of fire and lead. Eleanor stood on the porch, hand brushing the smooth plank of a new-fitted door. The old cabin, once drafty and broken, now stood proud with a patched roof, tight walls, and windows open to sunlight. No longer did she feel winter's cruel breath clawing through the boards at night. Mary ran laughing in the yard, skirts swirling, cradling a foal born from the long winter. Caleb shouldered timber beside the ranch hands, his face streaked with mud, eyes burning with a man's resolve. He was no longer the boy who once huddled by the fire for warmth, but a youth already tempered by trial. Out in the yard, Jonas directed the work. The bandage had long since left his shoulder. The wound was healed, leaving a scar deep and red. He bore himself different now, not as the half-dead stranger Eleanor had dragged in from the storm, but as a man whole, steady as an oak, eyes bright with new strength. That afternoon, when the labor stilled, Eleanor carried him a tin of water. Jonas drank, then set it down, his gaze fixed on her with a light that made her heart stumble. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low, warm. "There's something I need to tell you." She felt her breath catch, yet did not look away. Jonas reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden box. At once she knew it, the box she'd once hidden in William's old cupboard. He opened it. Inside lay William's silver wedding band. Eleanor's breath faltered. It was the ring her husband had worn, the one she had put away after his death. But now, set in the silver, gleamed a sapphire blue, bright as sky after rain. Jonas held her gaze, speaking slow and earnest. "This ring was William's. I cannot and will not take his place in your heart. But I would build a new home with you, not from ashes, but from memory, from love once given. This sapphire is my promise, that my love for you and the children will not erase the past, but stand with it to shape a future." Eleanor's chest tightened, her thoughts rushing back. Her simple wedding day with William, the nights by the fire, the night she lost him to the dark. She had believed her heart would never open again. Yet here was that same silver ring, bearing a new stone, speaking a truth she had not dared name. Love does not mean forgetting. It means carrying forward. Mary darted near, eyes wide as saucers. "Mama, Mr. Jonas, he's asking you to marry him, isn't he?" From a distance, Caleb stood still, silent, though hope lit his eyes. Eleanor trembled, words lost, when Jonas bent to one knee, his rough hand closing gently around hers. "Eleanor Whitmore," he said, steady as the earth itself, "I offer no riches, and I will not promise a life free of storm. I promise only this: you and your children will never face those storms alone again. Let me stand beside you, as husband, as father." The world hushed. Even the birds on the limbs seemed to pause. Eleanor bowed her head, tears slipping free. She touched the ring, then looked to her children. Caleb and Mary both nodded, their eyes shining. Caleb whispered, "Mama, I want to call him father." Mary cried out, "So do I." Eleanor's voice broke as she nodded. Jonas slid the ring upon her hand. Cold silver warmed at once against her skin, and she felt her trembling cease, replaced by peace as deep as a summer sky. He rose, drawing her into his arms. Mary clung to them both. Caleb stood tall beside, pride shimmering in his eyes. In that instant, they were no longer broken souls tied only by loss. They were family. Above them, the spring sky stretched wide and blue, soft wind carrying the breath of new grass. And in that light, The silver ring crowned with sapphire shone like a new star blazing after the long night. Spring had settled into its second month, and Bitter Creek no longer bore the harsh mask of winter. On the very fields once scorched by fire, green shoots rose like little candles, kindling light against the memory of darkness. The air carried hammer blows, sawdust, and the laughter of children. This was no longer a place waiting to be seized by the bank. The Double Cross Ranch, once broken, had been reborn with a new name, Morning Star Ranch. The name had been Jonas's gift. One night, by the fire, he had spoken softly of the morning star, the first light after the longest dark. Eleanor had listened in silence, tears glimmering in her eyes, before she whispered, "Yes, we have seen enough of darkness." Since then, the whole valley called it Morning Star, as if the ranch itself had become a promise that hope could survive both storms of heaven and storms of men. Caleb now worked the fields with steady hands. No longer just a boy clutching kindling, he had grown skilled with horses, quick at mending fences, and bold enough to ride with the older ranch hands. Mary, too, had changed. Each morning she carried fresh bread out to the workers, her small voice singing in the yard. Their laughter, once stifled by grief, now rang bright as the spring sun. Eleanor tended the kitchen and the new garden. She planted rows of flowers by the porch, not just for beauty, but as a whisper to William. "Do you see? The children are smiling again." Each evening she and Jonas walked the furrows, speaking of crops to plant, horses to raise, and a home that no longer shook beneath the wind. Jonas, though his shoulder still bore its scar, labored without pause. He built barns, drove fence posts, and more than that, rebuilt trust in a house once hollowed by sorrow. Each time Caleb tumbled from a saddle, Jonas was there to lift him up with a laugh. "Fall 100 times if you must. What matters is you rise." Mary sat by him as he carved little figures from wood, birds, horses, treasures she kept in a box of her own. One night, silver moonlight spread across the yard. Eleanor opened the family Bible, its pages worn, its ink smudged by old tears. There lay William's name, his wedding day, his death. Jonas sat beside her, silent. Eleanor lifted her pen, her hand trembling, and wrote beneath the faded lines. "That night, I saved a stranger from the storm. I did not know he was the answer to our prayer, as we, in turn, were the answer to his." Her breath shook, but the words stood firm, carved into the record of their lives. Caleb and Mary, peeking over her shoulder, read the line and whispered in unison, "Keep this forever, Mama." Eleanor drew them into her arms, her smile wet with tears. Jonas looked on, and for once his unyielding eyes glistened. In that moment, no oath was needed. This was proof enough of resurrection. The next day, Sheriff Miller rode in with papers. The sentence for Marcus Blackwood, now locked away in Denver awaiting trial, but his brother Jared had slipped into the night, vanishing into the wide frontier. Still, Eleanor did not tremble. If Jared should ever return, they would not face him alone. Morning Star was no longer just a ranch. It was a fortress built of faith and kinship. Each dusk, when the sun sank behind the peaks, the morning star glimmered in the east. Eleanor stood hand in hand with Jonas, watching. For her it was more than a point of light. It was a beacon for their new life, a sign that the long night was done. Bitter Creek itself had changed. Folks in town told and retold the tale, how a widow took in a dying stranger on a stormy night, and from that mercy was born Morning Star Ranch. The story traveled like wildfire, not as a legend of gunfights or vengeance, but of courage, kindness, and the rebirth of hope. And one quiet night, when the children slept, Eleanor added one more line to the family Bible. We have lost, we have feared, we have been betrayed. Yet out of the storm, the Lord sent us a man, and together we found life again and love. She closed the book, peace filling her chest. Outside, Morning Star Ranch lay beneath the heavens, a home reborn, its light unquenchable. From a ruined shack on the edge of Bitter Creek had risen a new star, where once a widow and her children braved the cold alone. Now stood a family bound by memory, by scars, and by a love forged true and late. The tale ends not in grief, but in gentle light. Loss remembered, yet turned into soil for new hope. And perhaps, in each of us, there lies a night of storm such as theirs, waiting for the moment when a single open hand can change the whole course of a life. What do you think? If you were Eleanor, would you dare open the door to a stranger on a stormy night? Share your thoughts below. And don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment so we can keep gathering around the fire to tell more stories from the Wild West, where trust and kindness shine like the morning star.